6 months after our wedding, I stopped taking birth control, and overnight, my husband became a stranger. The man I once adored now felt fragile, exhausting, unmanly. And worst of all, I couldn't stop wanting someone completely different. I'm 25 years old and questioning everything I thought I knew about myself. My name is Rachel, and this is how I went from being madly in love with my sensitive, artistic husband to craving someone completely different. Christopher and I met at my friend Jenna's gallery opening. He was standing in front of this abstract painting, head tilted, completely lost in thought. Something about the intensity in his eyes pulled me in. When I asked what he thought of the piece, he launched into this passionate analysis about color theory and emotional resonance that honestly went over my head. But the way he talked, like he was opening up his soul, I was instantly hooked. We spent the entire night in our own little world. He was different from any guy I'd dated before, not some meathead obsessed with sports or some finance bro fixated on his career. Christopher was deep. He read poetry for fun, played guitar, and could talk for hours about films I'd never heard of. I felt so special that this beautiful, thoughtful man wanted me. Our relationship was a whirlwind of late-night conversations, art exhibits, and obscure music festivals. When he took me to see his favorite band 6 months later and proposed during the encore of their most romantic song, I didn't hesitate to say yes. I still remember how his hands trembled as he slipped the vintage ring, a family heirloom from his mother, who raised him alone after his father left when he was a baby, onto my finger. Planning our wedding was a dream. Unlike my friends' fiancés, who just nodded along, Christopher had opinions on everything, from the floral arrangements to the font on our invitations. We created this bohemian-inspired ceremony that perfectly reflected our connection. I stayed on birth control, of course. We both wanted to establish our careers before thinking about kids. I'd been on the pill since college, and it seemed like the responsible choice. Our honeymoon in Prague was magical, wandering through cobblestone streets hand in hand, visiting museums, making love in our charming hotel room. I remember thinking I was the luckiest woman alive. Christopher would write little poems on hotel stationery and leave them for me to find throughout the day. He'd tear up when describing a particularly beautiful building or sunset. His emotional openness felt like a gift in a world of closed-off men. Back home, we settled into married life in our apartment filled with thrift store finds and art pieces Christopher had created. He worked at a graphic design studio while pursuing his own art on the side, and I had my job in digital content creation. Evenings were spent cooking together, watching foreign films, or just talking for hours. He'd massage my shoulders after a long day, and I'd listen to him process his feelings about work conflicts or creative blocks. It was perfect until it wasn't. About 6 months after our wedding, I started feeling off. My moods were all over the place, I had headaches, and my skin was breaking out like I was 16 again. During my annual checkup, my doctor mentioned that long-term birth control use could cause these issues. After 8 years on hormones, maybe my body needed a break. The decision to stop seemed logical. We could use condoms for a while, give my body a reset. Christopher was completely supportive, of course. I had no idea that little decision would completely upend my life. At first, the changes were subtle, my skin cleared up, my energy improved, and my cycles became regular for the first time in years. But then I noticed something else shifting, something I wasn't prepared for. I started getting irritated by things about Christopher that had never bothered me before, the way he spent 20 minutes choosing an outfit each morning, how he'd tear up during commercials with puppies, his constant need to process every emotion out loud. One night, we were at dinner with friends, and he went on this long, passionate rant about some obscure artist, gesturing wildly with his hands. I found myself looking around the restaurant, suddenly embarrassed. When had his expressiveness become so annoying? I caught our friend's husband, a stoic guy who worked construction, smirking slightly. I felt my cheeks burn with embarrassment. I started making less effort for Christopher. I'd wear sweatpants at home, no makeup, but when we go out, I'd dress more provocatively than ever, not for him. I'd catch other men looking at me and feel a thrill I hadn't experienced in ages. Have you noticed Christopher's gotten so skinny? I said to my friend Megan over coffee one day. I swear I could snap him in half. Why can't he just join a gym or something? You know artistic types, she replied with an eye roll. They think lifting a paintbrush is exercise. We laughed, and it felt good to voice these thoughts. But something in me knew this wasn't right. This wasn't who I was it? Arguments became more frequent. Christopher would get emotional over the smallest things, a critique of his work, a disagreement about dinner plans, and I'd find myself getting cold, distant. Why are you being so sensitive? I'd snap. When his eyes welled up during a fight, can you just be a man for once? The hurt in his eyes should have broken my heart. Instead, it just irritated me more. I'm just expressing how I feel, he'd say. What's wrong with that? Nothing's wrong with feelings, but you're constantly overwhelmed by them. It's exhausting. My friends, especially the single ones, fed into my growing resentment. You deserve someone who can match your energy, Jenna would say. Someone stronger. A relationship shouldn't be this much emotional work, added Megan. I started viewing our entire relationship history through a distorted lens. Had I ever really been attracted to Christopher, or had I just been charmed by the novelty of his sensitivity? Had our deep conversations actually been meaningful, or just pretentious garbage? I couldn't remember the good times anymore, only the frustrations. When Christopher suggested date nights to reconnect, I found excuses to be busy. When he left sweet notes like he used to, I'd read them with an internal eye roll. The man who had once seemed so perfect now felt like a stranger, or worse, like a roommate I was growing to resent. I didn't understand what was happening to me. I just knew that something fundamental had shifted, and there was no going back. 6 months after stopping birth control, I found myself noticing a completely different type of man: men with broad shoulders and calloused hands, men who didn't talk about their feelings or spend hours analyzing a painting, men who took up space unapologetically. At a barbecue hosted by friends, I met Doug. He was a welder, someone who built actual things with his hands, not just created pictures. Update 1. 6 months after our wedding, I stopped taking birth control, and overnight, my husband became a stranger. The man I once adored now felt fragile, exhausting, unmanly. And worst of all, I couldn't stop wanting someone completely different. Of them, he stood in the backyard, beer in hand, confident in a way Christopher never was. While Christopher hovered by the food table, overthinking his plate selection, Doug was manning the grill, making decisive choices, commanding the space. When we were introduced, he gave me a firm handshake and direct eye contact that made my stomach flip. His hands were rough, his forearms defined with muscle. He didn't ask what I did or what my passions were, all the pretentious first meeting talk I'd grown used to in Christopher's artistic circles. He just asked straightforward questions and gave real answers. "Nice to meet you, Rachel," he said, and something about the way my name sounded in his deep voice made me fix my hair and stand up straighter. I found myself gravitating toward him throughout the evening. When he mentioned needing a recommendation for a good coffee place near his workshop, I practically tripped over myself to offer suggestions. Before leaving, I boldly put my number in his phone under the guise of sending him the cafe details. That night, lying next to Christopher, who was reading poetry in bed, I texted Doug about the coffee shops. He responded immediately. Within days, our texts became more frequent, more personal. I made excuses to meet him for coffee, which turned into lunch, which turned into drinks. Being around Doug made me feel different, more feminine, somehow. I found myself laughing at his jokes, touching my hair, speaking more softly. He didn't ask about my feelings or tell me about his childhood traumas. He told stories, made decisions, held doors open. When he grazed my arm reaching for his drink, I felt electricity I hadn't experienced with Christopher in months. I ignored the red flags: how he made slightly controlling comments about women he dated before, how he expected the waitress to know his order without him clearly stating it, how he talked over me occasionally. These things didn't register as problems, they registered as strength. Meanwhile, at home, I grew more distant. Christopher would try to talk about our relationship, his voice cracking with emotion. "Something's changed, Rachel. Can we please talk about what's happening?" "Nothing's happening," I'd say coldly. "You are overreacting again. I think we should see a couples therapist," he suggested one night, and I nearly laughed in his face. "Therapy? Why does everything have to be so dramatic with you?" I was gaslighting him, making him think his very reasonable concerns were just him being too emotional. Part of me knew what I was doing was wrong, but I couldn't stop. I didn't want to stop. Then came the night Christopher picked up my phone when it buzzed while I was in the shower. I hadn't been careful enough, there were dozens of messages between Doug and me. Nothing explicitly sexual, but the flirtation was undeniable. When I came out of the bathroom, Christopher was sitting on the edge of the bed, my phone in his hands, tears streaming down his face. "How long has this been going on?" he asked, his voice breaking. "It's not what you think," I said automatically, though it was exactly what he thought. "Don't lie to me," he whispered. "Please, at least give me the respect of the truth." The fight that followed was explosive. Christopher cycled through hurt, anger, confusion, sobbing 1 minute, shouting the next. All I felt was cold irritation. His emotional display just confirmed what I'd been feeling: we were fundamentally incompatible. "I want a divorce," I said flatly. "This isn't working anymore." "Is it because of him?" Christopher asked, gesturing to my phone. "It's because of us," I replied. "I'm not happy. I haven't been for a while. We can work on this," he pleaded. "People go through phases. Maybe it's not a phase." I cut him off. "I don't feel the same anymore. I don't think I ever will." The next day, I started looking for apartments. Christopher tried one last time to salvage things, suggesting we take a weekend away to reconnect. I dismissed the idea immediately. In my mind, our marriage was already over, I was just waiting for the paperwork to catch up. "I think we should try to keep this amicable," Christopher said, his voice small. "For both our sakes." I agreed, though not out of any concern for his feelings. I just wanted it over with as quickly as possible. Doug was already sending me listings for apartments near his place. I met with a lawyer the following week. "You should ask for alimony," she suggested after hearing about our situation. "Your lifestyle will change significantly after the divorce." "But I'm the one leaving," I pointed out. "And I have my own income." "Doesn't matter," she replied. "You've been married for over a year, and he makes more than you. You're entitled to support." The idea appealed to me, despite the obvious unfairness. Why shouldn't I get something out of this failed experiment? I decided to push for a financial settlement that would give me a cushion as I started my new life with Doug. I moved out the following week, filed for divorce immediately. My friends were split, some supporting me, finding true happiness, others shocked by how quickly I dismantled my marriage. You were entitled to half of everything, encouraged Megan, who'd never liked Christopher anyway. That's the law. When Christopher received the divorce papers with my alimony demands, he called me, disbelief in his voice. Alimony, really, Rachel? After everything? I'm just following my lawyer's advice, I said coolly. This is business now. The hurt in his voice should have affected me, but it didn't. I was already mentally moved on, picturing my life with Doug, a man who would never cry over paperwork. Doug and I became official almost immediately. I started spending most nights at his place, cooking him dinner, cleaning up without the resentment I'd felt doing the same for Christopher. Doug's apartment was sparsely decorated, practical, the opposite of the curated artistic space I'd shared with my husband. I found comfort in its simplicity. You look prettier with your hair down, Doug commented one evening. Soon I was wearing it down daily. That guy from your office keeps texting you pretty late, he observed another time. I found myself creating distance from male colleagues without even being directly asked. My mom stayed home when she got married, he mentioned casually. That's how I want it when we have kids. These comments should have been warnings, but I dismissed them. This was masculinity, this was what I wanted, wasn't it? One night, about 3 months into our relationship, I mentioned a potential promotion at work. Doug's reaction surprised me. Why would you want more responsibility? You're already stressed enough with what you do now. It would mean more money, I explained. And I'd be leading a team, which is something I've always wanted. Is money really an issue? He asked, frowning. I make enough, and once we get more serious, you probably won't want to work as much anyway. I felt a flicker of unease but pushed it aside. His traditional views were part of what attracted me to him, his certainty about how things should be. It was refreshing after Christopher's endless questioning and let's figure this out together approach to everything. Still, I found myself not mentioning work as much around Doug. When I got the promotion a few weeks later, I downplayed my excitement, mentioning it casually over dinner rather than celebrating like I wanted to. Meanwhile, the divorce proceedings moved forward. Christopher didn't fight my alimony request, though he could have. His lawyer simply requested a 2-year limit rather than contesting it outright. Final update. 6 months after our wedding, I stopped taking birth control, and overnight, my husband became a stranger. The man I once adored now felt fragile, exhausting, unmanly. And worst of all, I couldn't stop wanting someone completely different than the indefinite arrangement my lawyer had proposed. I agreed, disappointed I couldn't get more but eager to finalize everything. 4 months into our relationship, I ran into Christopher at a local coffee shop. I almost didn't recognize him. He looked good, better than I remembered. He'd started working out, his shoulders were broader under a well-fitted shirt. He had a new haircut, a confidence I hadn't seen before. Rachel, he said with a genuine smile, how are you? There was no bitterness in his voice, no lingering pain in his eyes, just polite interest, maybe even warmth. We chatted briefly. He'd received a promotion at work, his art had been featured in a small gallery. He seemed happy, truly happy, in a way that caught me off guard. As we were about to part ways, he said something I wasn't prepared for. I want to thank you, Rachel. Thank me? I asked, confused. For ending things when you did, he said simply. It hurt a lot, but it forced me to find myself again, to figure out who I am outside of us. I'm actually grateful. I stood there speechless. Christopher gave me a small nod and walked away, leaving me feeling strangely hollow. That night, Doug and I fought when I mentioned my promotion again. Explaining that I'd need to attend a conference out of town, I said. So you'll be in a hotel with all your coworkers, including that guy who texts you, he snapped. My whole team will be there, I explained. It's not a social thing, it's work. I just don't understand why this job is so important to you. You were always talking about wanting a family someday, he said, shaking his head. How's that going to work with all these responsibilities? I felt a sudden flashback to Christopher encouraging me to apply for my first promotion, helping me prepare for the interview, celebrating with champagne when I got it. The contrast was stark. But then Doug pulled me close, his strong arms around me, and the doubt receded. This was just an adjustment period, we'd figure it out. The physical chemistry between us was still electric, still undeniable. The divorce was finalized a week later. I felt a strange mix of emotions, relief, certainly, but also an unexpected melancholy. 8 years with Christopher, between dating and marriage, wiped away with a signature. In a strange way, it felt like losing a part of myself. A few days after, scrolling through social media, I came across a post from a mutual friend, a group photo at an art gallery. Christopher was there, standing next to a woman I didn't recognize. She wasn't conventionally beautiful, but there was something striking about her. They weren't touching in the photo, but they stood close, comfortable. The caption mentioned First Friday at the new downtown gallery. Nothing about relationships, but something in the way they angled toward each other spoke volumes. I felt an unexpected pang, not jealousy, exactly, but something adjacent to it. Had Christopher already moved on so completely? Was I that easy to replace? I closed the app and rolled over to face Doug, who was watching sports highlights on his phone. He didn't look up. I studied his profile, the strong jaw, the stubbled cheeks, the solidity of him. This was what I wanted, this was who I wanted. But that night, I had trouble sleeping. My mind kept returning to Christopher's words at the coffee shop, to his apparent happiness, to how quickly he seemed to have rebuilt his life without me. A week later, I was alone at Doug's apartment while he was at a poker night with friends I hadn't met yet, despite our relationship progressing rapidly. I found myself Googling phrases like personality changes after stopping birth control and hormonal contraceptives affect attraction. The results were eye-opening. Multiple studies suggested that hormonal birth control could influence partner selection, potentially leading women to be attracted to different types of men than they would choose naturally. Some women reported significant changes in their relationships after stopping hormonal contraception, including decreased attraction to their partners. Had that happened to me? Had birth control masked my true desires for 8 years, only for them to emerge when I stopped taking it? Was this dramatic shift in my attractions and behavior not a revelation but a hormonal upheaval? For a moment, I considered the possibility that I destroyed my marriage because of a chemical change in my body, that the love I'd felt for Christopher had been real, just different. But that would mean acknowledging I'd made a terrible mistake, that I'd hurt someone who loved me deeply for something beyond either of our control. That wasn't a truth I was ready to face. When Doug came home slightly drunk and more controlling than usual, checking my location on my phone just to see where you've been, I let it slide. When he made a dismissive comment about your artsy ex-husband after seeing a text from a mutual friend about Christopher's gallery showing, I didn't defend Christopher. We should move in together officially, Doug suggested a few days later. No point paying for 2 places. I agreed readily, ignoring the voice in my head pointing out how different this was from the careful, thoughtful way Christopher and I had approached moving in together. This was decisive, masculine, it made sense. As I packed up my temporary apartment, coming across a few leftover items from my marriage, a book Christopher had given me, a small sketch he'd done of my profile, I felt a moment of doubt so intense it nearly took my breath away. What if I'd made a catastrophic mistake? But then I remembered how unbearable Christopher's sensitivity had become, how irritating his artistic pretensions had felt, how exhausting it had been to be the stable, practical one in a relationship. No, I'd made the right choice. This was who I really was, who I was meant to be with. So I settled back into Doug's arms that night, ignoring the way he checked my phone when he thought I wasn't looking, pushing away thoughts of Christopher's genuine smile and grateful words. This was where I belonged now, this was what I wanted. And if sometimes in quiet moments I wondered what might have been, well, that was a small price to pay for following my true nature. After all, you can't fight biology, can you? But in those quiet moments, when Doug was asleep and I was left alone with my thoughts, I sometimes wondered if it wasn't biology at all, if maybe I just wanted change and escape from the responsibility of being an equal partner in a relationship that required emotional work from both of us. If I'd taken the easy path of blaming hormones rather than looking at my own choices. Those thoughts never lasted long. I'd push them away, curl closer to Doug's solid warmth, and remind myself that this was real, this was right, this was exactly what I wanted. Even if occasionally in my dreams I still heard Christopher reading poetry in that earnest voice of his, even if sometimes I caught myself missing the depth of connection we'd shared, those were just echoes, remnants of a relationship I'd outgrown, weren't they?